Hey, this is Mrs. Sewell, and I'm just going over the parts of a neuron for people that were absent on Wednesday. So, our learning target is just to learn the parts of a neuron and understand how impulses are generated. So, I'm going to try and do it in 15 minutes or less. So, why do we study this? We're looking at biological bases of behavior, and this is the neurons are the really the basic unit of psychology and parts of the brain that cause our behavior. So you need to be able to label the parts of the neuron and describe the transmission of the signal. All right, so we start with a neuron. If you go back to the PowerPoint or the Nearpod and watch the videos, those 2-minute videos, they're super helpful. So I encourage you to do those. Just there's a hyperlink with where it says neuron, it's hyperlinked. Okay, so we've got about 86 billion neurons in our brain. Neurons are just cells of the nervous system, and so the central nervous system, the spine, and the brain are where you're going to find neurons. They are not the only cells in the brain. We also have glia cells that protect and nourish the neurons, and then we also have astrocytes. So, but the one we need to know for AP Psych is the neuron. Here's the structure of a neuron. You want to know the parts, and we'll start and work left to right. On the left, you have the cell body, which is also called the soma, S-O-M-A. So you want to know it's the soma. That is not the nucleus. So you see over that little circle in the center of the soma, that's the nucleus. That's where the DNA is stored, but it is not the soma. The soma is the cell body. And that is really the thing that supports the cell. Attached to the soma are dendrites. Dendrites are the receivers for the neurons. They will actually receive messages in the form of chemicals called neurotransmitters from other neurons. Those neurotransmitters will bind to little receptors on the dendrites. So I think of the dendrites as the ears of the neuron. They are picking up the signal, okay? But the signal is a chemical signal when it comes in. So it binds to the dendrites, okay? Once you have enough of the signal to reach what's called threshold, then the cell body will, or the soma will then start an electrical signal called an action potential, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the next part, so on the right, is that long tube structure. Okay, that's the axon running through the middle of a sheath called the myelin sheath. So if you think of an electrical cord where you have the plastic coating, that's the myelin sheath, and the wires on the inside, that bundle of wires, that would be your axon. So the axon is just a bundle of fibers that run through the center of that myelin sheath. And the axon is where the electric signal will pass. It will pass down the membrane of the axon. The myelin sheath that looks like kind of like hot dogs covering the axon, those are just Schwann cells that make up the myelin sheath. It protects the axon, and it also speeds up the signal. So it helps the signal go faster. If the myelin sheath breaks down, that is an indicator of the disease that's called multiple sclerosis, and that slows down your muscles and your ability to speak and things like that. So that is an important protective covering that we have on neurons. All right. So the signal will travel down. Then the ends of the axon kind of splay out at the end, and those are called the terminal branches of the axon. And at the very end of the terminal branches are these little bulbs. They're called the terminal buttons. And if you looked really closely at those terminal buttons, you'd see little sacs called vesicles on the terminal buttons. And those vesicles hold this neuron's transmitters. And so those are called terminal buttons. They're also called synaptic buttons. Two neurons never touch each other. There's always just a tiny, tiny little space between them. And that space between two neurons is called the synapse. Sometimes they'll call it the synaptic cleft or the synaptic gap, but that's the space in between. So you got to know what the synapse is. In order to label a synapse, you'd have to have two neurons to show the space. All right, here's an up close of the synapse. You see at the top the terminal button from an axon. You can see the little sacs that are called vesicles, and inside those little triangles are, indicating neurotransmitters. And then you have the gap, okay, and you see that it's labeled as the synapse. And then underneath you'll see a dendrite from another neuron, and that's little receptors. The neurotransmitters are fired into that synapse, and then they bind to the receptors on the dendrite. And that's what's going to cause the action potential that we'll look at next. Okay, this view is on the test every now and again. So it's just a close up. They're zeroing in on the synapse and you see, again, a terminal button from one neuron and then the dendrite of another neuron. Okay, and so again, try and come watch the videos. They don't show in here, you don't get any sound. All right, we're going to skip the progress check. I'm in the Nearpod. All right, so how does a neuron fire? Okay, when it fires, it creates this electrical signal. It's called an action potential. When the neuron is waiting to receive neurotransmitters, it's at resting potential. Okay, it's just waiting to receive it. When it gets enough of the neurotransmitters, so enough neurotransmitters come across the synapse and bind on the receptors on the dendrites, okay, once they get to the minimum amount required, that is called threshold. Threshold is the minimum amount of neurotransmitters needed to initiate an action potential, okay? The minimum amount of neurotransmitters needed to initiate an action potential. So once enough neurotransmitters bind to those receptor sites on the dendrites and threshold is released, then the soma will, which is the cell body, will initiate the action potential. And you'll see an electrical signal start and travel all the way down the axon. Okay, so step one, the dendrites receive the neurotransmitter, okay, from another neuron, so they bind to the receptors. Step two, once there's enough excitatory chemicals, that's neurotransmitters, or they outnumber the inhibitory neurotransmitters, then threshold is reached. So we have neurotransmitters that get the neurons to fire, they're excitatory, and we have neurotransmitters that are inhibitory that try and keep it from firing. Okay, once you reach threshold, you have enough excitatory neurotransmitters, the neuron will fire. It's an all or none response, which means it reaches threshold and it fires, or it doesn't reach threshold and it does not fire. There's no halfway. As it shows on the next slide, there's a video. Go watch the videos. It's like a gun. It either fires or it doesn't fire. So you either meet threshold and the axon, or it's not the axon, and the neuron fires. If you don't meet threshold, it doesn't fire. All right. Once the soma initiates the action potential, this electrical charge will start on the axon. And when it's coming across the axon, little portals or channels in the axon membrane open, and it lets in positive sodium ions. They're normally outside of the membrane, and they start to mix with potassium ions. They're negatively charged that are inside the axon membrane. When this happens, that's called depolarization. When sodium is on the outside and the potassium is on the inside, it's polarized. That's called polarization. The action potential will cause depolarization, and that's going to open those channels, and the sodium, the positively charged sodium and the negatively charged potassium will mix with each other. That's depolarization, okay? And it'll just keep opening channels along the axon until this electrical charge reaches the axon terminals. And then when that happens, it will cause the vesicles and the terminal buttons to release the neurotransmitter. So that neuron will fire, all right? And so that is, then the neurotransmitters will go out into the synapse, and then they will, usually be enough to cause the next neuron to fire. So those are the steps in an action potential, okay? In the slides, this is much better, so you may want to look at it there. There's another, just something for you to read that talks about it, so you can just pause it and read that. All right, and then we got to Club Neuron on Wednesday, so if you were here for Club Neuron, you should be all set. So remember, you got to know the parts of the neuron and then the steps in the action potential.